You're listening to
Catholic Sprouts,
the daily podcast for Catholic kids that strives to plant seeds of faith.
Hello, Sprouts. Today is Wednesday, March 15th. It's the feast of St. Louise de Marillac, and I'm Cecilia Leskowitz from the Hildegard Collective, a ministry for Catholic musicians. We're going to be time traveling again through musical history today, from the 1600s through the early 1800s. Now, yesterday we learned about the Renaissance, that huge explosion of music and art from the 1300s to the 1500s. We learned about the Protestant Reformation and how the church saw that music and art were important for helping the church heal. And we met our friend Giovanni Palestrina and learned about how he wrote some of the most beautiful sacred music that's ever been written. Now, music began to change again in the period of time that we call the Baroque era. There were a few very important things that happened in this time period. Key signatures became a thing. Key signatures are a way to organize sets of musical notes that make sense together, and we still use those today. Instruments like the flute, the violin, and the cello became more like the way they are today, and composers really liked to write for them. And the opera became a thing. Have you ever watched a Disney movie with music, like Frozen, or Tangled, or Beauty and the Beast? These are called musicals, which are stories with songs that help move the story along. Operas are kind of like the grandma of musicals. And we're actually going to hear about an opera in a couple of days, but for now, we're going to head on over to Italy for a bit and meet a very special friend. Antonio Vivaldi was a Catholic priest in Italy who was also a very talented musician. He taught music lessons at a Catholic school in Venice, and when he wasn't teaching music, he was writing it. In fact, he was so good at writing music that he wrote about 800 pieces of it, and his specialty was the concerto. If you play a musical instrument, you may already know what a concerto is. But for all our friends who don't know, a concerto is a piece of music written for an orchestra that features one or two instruments. Think of it kind of like a band. You've got the main singer, and then you have all the backup musicians, like the person who plays the guitar, or the piano, or the electric bass. That's what the concerto is like. The main instrument in the concerto is like the main singer, and the orchestra is like the backup musicians. Father Vivaldi wrote almost 500 concertos while he was alive. Now we're going to move from the Baroque time period into the classical time period in the 1700s. Baroque music was very ornamental and extravagant, but people started to get tired of that. They wanted to hear some lighter music. You know how a brownie is really dense, while an angel food cake is super light and fluffy? That's kind of like the difference between music from the Baroque era and the classical era. Baroque music is like the brownie, dense and thick, while music from the classical time period is like very light, like the angel food cake. One of the most famous composers from the classical era, and probably in all of music history, was a man named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He was born in 1756 in Salzburg, Austria, and he was baptized Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgangus Theophilus Mozart, because he was born on the feast of St. John Chrysostom. But as he got older, he ended up dropping the Johannes Chrysostomus and changed Theophilus to Amadeus, which means loved by God. Mozart showed talent for music at a very young age. He composed his first piece of music when he was only 4 years old, and by the time he was 6, he was touring Austria and Germany, playing the piano in concerts. Mozart wrote music for every genre that was available at the time. Solo music, music for small groups of instruments, choir music, orchestra music, operas, you name it, he wrote it. He also had an intensely cool talent for being able to copy something down perfectly just by hearing it. When he was 14, he was at Mass at the Vatican when he heard a setting of the Miserere, Psalm 51. And it was only done by the Sistine Chapel Choir twice a year, once on the Wednesday of Holy Week, and then again 2 days later on Good Friday. Nobody else was allowed to sing this particular piece of music, and you couldn't just get a copy of the sheet music. But Mozart heard this piece of music on the Wednesday of Holy Week and wrote it down from memory when he got home. He went back on Good Friday to hear it again and corrected a few little mistakes when he'd gotten back home, and then he sent it to a publisher. The whole of Europe was in an uproar, and the Pope had him come to the Vatican. Mozart thought he would be in trouble, but the Pope actually thought it was super cool that Mozart was able to do this, and he made him a papal knight. When Mozart was 19, he wrote one of his best-known works, Solemn Vespers for a Confessor. Remember how we learned about the Liturgy of the Hours and how it's all 150 psalms sung at different times each day throughout the week? Vespers is the name for one of those times, and Mozart wrote a setting of it for an unknown feast day. This is one of Mozart's most beautiful works of music, and it glorifies God so well. In addition to this piece, he wrote many other works of sacred music, including a piece called Ave Verum Corpus that is still often sung by church choirs today. A little-known fact about Mozart is that he actually took his Catholic faith really seriously. He wrote in many of his letters about God and his faith. In one of his letters, he wrote to his dad, "God is ever before my eyes. I realize his omnipotence and I fear his anger, but I also recognize his love, his compassion, and his tenderness towards his creatures. He will never forsake his own. Thus all will be well, and I must be happy and contented." Mozart died when he was only 35 years old, but the legacy he left behind and the impact he made on music, especially his contributions to sacred music, will always be remembered. Well, Sprouts, that's about it for this time period. Tomorrow, we're going to travel to the 1800s, where we're going to learn about the Romantic time period, how the world and music began to change really quickly, and about a composer who went away from God for a long time, but came back to him with his whole heart.
That's it for Catholic Sprouts today. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, continue to grow in your faith and truly sprout into the beautiful creation that God created you to be.
Hello, parents. Thanks so much for letting me get to share all about music history in the Catholic Church with your kids today. I'm the co-founder of the Hildegard Collective, a nonprofit that helps Catholic musicians grow in their faith and meet like-minded musicians. We've got an active podcast and blog going that you can check out, and soon we'll be launching a platform for connection and faith formation as well. The Hildegard Collective was a finalist in the 2022 OSV Innovation Challenge, which is a program designed to build up innovative projects and ministries for the church today. If you want to learn more about what we do, check out the show notes for our website, podcast, and social media links. If you're a Catholic musician, we invite you to come join us. And if you know a Catholic musician, we invite you to share our ministry with them. Thanks so much for listening, and God bless.
This podcast is part of the Spoke Street Network. For more great podcasts, visit spokestreet.com.